Winters in Wyoming are often harsh, and that winter was no exception. Alfred Brown lived in a small town lost in the eastern part of the state and had long been accustomed to the difficult weather conditions of his region. That morning, his wife Charlotte felt a bit unwell. She was getting chills and thought that she could be coming down with a cold or even the flu. Since they didn't have any meds at home, Alfred decided to go to the pharmacy to get some cold medicine and vitamins for his wife. Unfortunately, it had been raining all night, and when the frost hit, the water froze and the road got covered in a thin layer of ice. Alfred looked anxiously out the window and shook his head. The local road authorities were in no hurry to sprinkle salt or sand on the roadway, which looked like solid glass. "How are you supposed to go out there? Maybe you should just stay home?" Charlotte asked cautiously. Alfred looked tenderly at his wife and shook his head. He knew that he wouldn't leave his wife without meds and would go to the pharmacy no matter what. "It's okay, dear. I'll be careful. It'll be fine." The old man reassured his wife and started getting ready. His beat-up Ford was parked in the garage and looked like new. Mr. Brown lovingly touched his polished door and smiled. "It's too bad that Chris can't see you now," the old man thought and brushed away a tear. Trying not to dwell on his sad thoughts, the old man opened the garage door and carefully drove into the parking lot in front of the house. The road really was covered in ice, which meant that it would be hard to control the car. "It's okay, I won't go fast," Mr. Brown whispered, driving out onto the road. To the old man's relief, it wasn't as hard to control the car at a low speed as he expected. Seeing that things weren't as bad as they first seemed, Mr. Brown relaxed noticeably. The section of the road didn't have much traffic, so the old man allowed himself to get a bit distracted in order to turn on the radio and find some retro music to listen to. Alfred Brown didn't think that he'd lost sight of the road for more than just a brief moment, but it was enough for the irreparable to happen. Having looked up, the elderly man noticed that the car in front of him had slowed to a stop a few yards away, but it was too late. Despite the fact that Alfred Brown immediately pushed the brake pedal, his Ford couldn't stop on the icy road and crashed into the rear bumper of the brand new Bentley with a vile screech. Even though the blow wasn't strong, the old man still smashed his nose into the steering wheel and hurt his chin. Realizing that there was probably a dent in the Bentley's bumper, Mr. Brown wondered how much it would cost him to repair this expensive car. "Well, that's a rather unfortunate trip to the pharmacy. I'm definitely going to lose my peace over this, and it's all my fault. It will take me forever to pay for the repairs," the old man caught himself thinking. Mr. Brown sat in the car for a little while, deliberately delaying the moment when he'd have to face the Bentley driver. But there was no avoiding it. He had to get out eventually. The old man wiped his blood with the handkerchief and opened the door to leave the warm interior of his Ford. The Bentley's driver had already assessed the damage and was patiently waiting for Mr. Brown. Just looking at the man, it was obvious that he was a successful businessman. The dent on the bumper was small, but very noticeable, especially given the brand new shiny paint and the bright sunlight. Mr. Brown's Ford, on the other hand, was almost unscathed and had only a minor crack in the headlight. "How could this have happened? I'm sorry, sir, I didn't mean to," the old man started saying, but the driver of the Bentley stopped him mid-sentence. The man was in his 40s. He had a strong chin and gray, sad eyes that looked at the world with a hint of irony. "Do you have a driver's license? Let me see it," the stranger said instead of a greeting. "Yes, sir. Of course I have it. Here it is. Unfortunately, I don't have any money right now, but I'll figure something out," the old man murmured, holding out his documents to the man. The stranger put the old man's driver's license in his pocket and said, "Well, it's great that you'll figure something out. I'll come by your place in a couple of days. We can discuss the details then." Tears welled up in Alfred Brown's eyes. Ignoring this fact, the stranger nodded goodbye, got into his car, and started the engine. In less than a minute, the Bentley blended in with other cars heading downtown. "Well, now I don't even have my license," the old man thought, getting agitated, and headed for the pharmacy located nearby. Mr. Brown returned home in a very bad mood. Charlotte didn't know why her husband was upset, so she took the medicine he brought and started waiting for an explanation. Mr. Brown was silent for a moment, and then he said, "Our quiet life is over, Charlotte. I crashed into an expensive car, and now I'll have to pay a lot of money to repair it." "How much is a lot?" the woman gasped, clasping her hands. Mr. Brown just shook his head and looked at the photo of his son standing on the bedside table. "If only you were alive, Chris," the old man whispered with anguish. Mr. Brown's mind went hazy for a moment. His thoughts took him back to the events that happened 15 years ago, when their son was still alive. From early childhood, Chris Brown was a headstrong child with a tough character and strong moral values. When the boy grew up and graduated from high school, he needed to decide what he wanted to do with the rest of his life. His parents wanted Chris to go study law or economics, but the young man dreamed of something completely different. Chris was attracted to the sky from an early age. It seemed like the most fascinating thing in the world to him. In order to fulfill his dream, Chris decided to get a helicopter pilot license, so he took a course that trained specialists in civil aviation. Of course, the man's decision went against the will of his parents, but the young man still got what he wanted. If only the Browns could have known what awaited Chris in the future. Chris was always very ambitious, and he never shied away from any difficulties on his way to achieving his goals. That was why he took the job as a pilot in one of the gold mines in Alaska. Naturally, Alfred and Charlotte were against their son's decision, but they couldn't convince him to change his mind. Right before going to Alaska, Chris tried to make peace with his parents by buying his father a used car. Alfred Brown looked at the old Ford and shook his head. It was obvious that the man didn't like the gift and didn't really want it. More than anything else in the world, Alfred wanted his son to stay home and not follow his dream to the other side of the country. Unfortunately, Chris wasn't the kind of person who would just concede, so he didn't back down. This was the reason for the fight the father and son had the day before Chris's departure, which Alfred Brown would never be able to forget. Going off to Alaska, Chris couldn't have known that it would be the last time he would ever see his parents. By an evil twist of fate, the young pilot died a year later when his helicopter was caught in a snowstorm and crashed in the middle of an icy slope. The news of his death came as a heavy blow for Alfred and Charlotte Brown, who'd lost their only son. Only then did Alfred realize that the car his son had bought him was probably the only gift he had to remember his son by. Ever since then, the man started taking great care of his Ford, always parking it in the garage to protect it from the elements. And now, 15 years later, the car became the source of his problem, solving which would require a lot of money. Of course, Alfred understood that he was the only one responsible for what had happened, but it didn't make him feel any better. This businessman is probably going to come over with a bunch of lawyers, and they'll take everything we have, the man said, shuddering at every sound that he heard outside. 3 days went by in anxious anticipation, and when the couple had started thinking that no one would come, there was a loud knock on the door. "Well, that's it. We should get ready for the worst," Mr. Brown thought. Having opened the door, the old man wasn't the least bit surprised to see the Bentley's driver standing in front of him. Having politely greeted the owners of the house, the man stepped inside and stopped in the middle of the living room. Charlotte Brown caught the visitor's eye and was very surprised to realize he was looking at the photograph of their late son. "That's Chris, our son. He died 15 years ago in one of the mines in Alaska," the woman explained. However, the expression on the man's face made it clear that he didn't need an explanation. "I knew your son, ma'am," the guest said in a trembling voice. "What? How did you know him?" Mr. Brown said. The stranger sighed sadly, sat at the edge of the chair, and started telling his story. As it turned out, the guest's name was Jonathan Price. Like the late Chris Brown, he was a commercial pilot who worked in the harsh environment of Alaska. Moreover, Jonathan and Chris often flew together as co-pilots. Both in the cockpit and beyond, the young pilots had a very friendly relationship and even felt that they could be brothers. Even the fact that Chris was from Wyoming and Jonathan was from Kentucky couldn't affect their friendship. Everything was going well until that tragic flight, when the friends got into a terrible snowstorm. Due to the non-flying weather, all the flights were canceled that day, but unfortunately, one of the mine workers had an ulcer and needed urgent evacuation. Chris was piloting that flight. He tried his best to keep the helicopter in the air. Unfortunately, the helicopter didn't reach its destination by a couple of miles and crashed into a snow-covered hill. Chris got the worst of it in the crash. Jonathan had both of his legs broken, and the patient escaped with minor bruises. During the last moments of his life, Jonathan was the only person next to Chris. He was the last person Chris saw before dying. And now, sitting in the living room of the Brown family home, the man couldn't hold back his tears. Chris asked me to tell you he was very sorry about that fight you had before he left. And he also wanted to ask for your forgiveness, the guest said, stammering at every word. The owners of the house didn't say a word, but simply started crying at this point. Jonathan continued talking, telling the couple about how he'd spent several months in a wheelchair while his legs healed, and how after that he had to give up flying. It took the former pilot a long time to find his place in this life, but he finally went into business, which allowed the man to achieve everything he couldn't even dream of before. Jonathan never forgot the promise he made to Chris and tried to find his parents from time to time. However, it was only 15 years after the tragedy that he finally managed to do it. Having asked the Browns for their forgiveness, the former pilot felt the relief that he had dreamed of all of those years. Hugging Jonathan, Alfred and Charlotte seemed to have been transported into the past, to the time when their son was still alive and dreamed of conquering the sky. The three of them sat together for a long time, remembering funny stories from the past. With every passing second, they grew more convinced that Chris didn't die, but simply went to heaven and was now looking at them with that very sweet smile that was captured in his last photo.